After d4, d5, if you're not interested in learning all of the theory and complications after c4, the Queen's Gambit, you may decide to try out a d4 system. In these d4 systems, White usually has a very clear plan where to develop the pieces, so by following these plans, White can usually create a solid position and focus on reaching a playable middle game where understanding and experience will be more important than memorization. Today we're going to look at two popular d4 systems, the London and Colle systems. The key move in the London is playing bishop f4, developing the bishop to an active diagonal. Unlike the Queen's Gambit, when White places immediate pressure on Black's center with c4, White's idea is to reinforce the d4 pawn with e3 and c3, creating a solid central pawn pyramid. White's light-squared bishop typically moves to d3, and the knights help control the center with knight f3 and knight b to d2. It's common for White to castle, followed by playing a move such as queen e2, preparing to open up the position with e4. The Colle system shares the same ideas, except the bishop on f4 remains on c1 for the time being. Of course, Black has something to say about all of these ideas, but this is the general piece development you can follow in order to play the London or Colle. After the moves d4 and d5, in order to play the London system, White can play knight f3 followed by bishop f4, or else immediately play bishop f4. This is the trademark London system move, developing the dark-squared bishop to an active diagonal before playing e3. A natural response for Black is to continue to develop with knight f6, when White supports the center with e3. A popular continuation for Black is to support the center and prepare kingside development with e6. Knight f3 is a common and sensible choice, but sometimes White prefers to play knight d2, helping support the center and keeping the d1 to h5 diagonal open for the time being. Notice that developing the knight to d2, as opposed to the more active c3 square, allows White to support the center with c3. Since White's dark-squared bishop exerts long-term pressure on the h2 to b8 diagonal, it makes sense for Black to challenge this bishop with bishop d6. White can respond to this dark-squared bishop standoff by playing knight g to f3, allowing Black to trade bishops with bishop takes f4, accepting doubled pawns, but clamping down on the dark squares with e takes f4. For the interested viewer, this is an interesting structure to explore, but a straightforward and solid way to play is bishop g3. White secures the bishop and invites Black to play bishop takes g3, allowing White to activate the rook on h1 with h takes g3, creating unpleasant pressure down the h-file. Black typically avoids this exchange and maintains the tension by castling. We see the typical London system ideas come to life with bishop d3, developing the light-squared bishop on an active diagonal pointing directly at Black's castled kingside. Black typically responds by adding pressure against White's center and grabbing space with c5. In response to c5, White typically plays c3, supporting the d4 square, and also extending the b1 to h7 diagonal in case Black tries to attack the bishop with c4, allowing White to retreat the light-squared bishop and maintaining its active presence on this desirable diagonal. The light-squared bishop is an excellent piece for White, so one solid option to explore is b6, preparing to exchange light-squared bishops with bishop a6. We're going to focus on the straightforward continuation knight c6, continuing to develop and supporting the center. White's typical developmental scheme continues with knight g to f3, when one sensible continuation for Black is to play queen e7, centralizing the queen and preparing to open up the position with e5. When you play a d4 system such as the London, it's important not to make your moves automatically. You always need to pay attention to your opponent's ideas, because if White automatically castles the king, now that there is no longer a rook on the h-file, Black can favorably trade bishops with bishop takes g3, h takes g3, followed by striking in the center with e5. Black grabs space in the center and also opens up the light-squared bishop. When Black is able to safely play e5, this usually suggests Black should not experience any serious problems out of the opening, as is the case in this position. Instead of allowing the pawn break e5, White can play the thematic London system move, knight e5. White's knight enjoys this central post, taking space and blockading Black's e6 pawn. This is the type of position white is trying to achieve, straightforward development with a comfortable position. Although the London system can look like a peaceful, mostly positional opening, it contains quite a bit of venom. Take for example the position after black plays knight d7. Fighting for control of the e5 square. In some London positions, white supports a knight on e5 with f4. But in this particular situation, white can play the tricky knight takes d7. In order to justify this continuation, black needs to play the counterintuitive move queen takes d7. This is far from obvious, and it will take a few moves for us to understand. Grandmaster Sam Shankland, playing black, responded with the natural bishop takes d7. It turns out that this is a suboptimal continuation, as Grandmaster Gadakomsky, a legendary London system advocate, initiated the forced sequence bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, and d takes c5. Grandmaster Shankland is lured into an incredible trap after queen takes c5. Usually it isn't a good policy to trade several pieces and help your opponent develop, but in this particular case, white had prepared the devastating blow, bishop takes h7 check. You always need to look out for bishop takes h7 sacrifices in the London, but this seems like a strange sacrifice after king takes h7. White has traded and sacrificed almost all of his developed pieces, yet this incredible idea works thanks to queen h5 check. Attacking the enemy king and aligning with black's queen on the 5th rank. After the forced response king g8. White can take advantage of the pinned d5 pawn with knight e4. Attacking black's queen and preparing the deadly knight g5, threatening checkmate on h7. Only at this point does it become apparent that black should have left the bishop on c8 and recaptured on d7 with the queen. With the bishop on c8, black could save the position with g6, counterattacking white's queen. But with the bishop on d7, g6 would fail to knight takes c5, when white regains the sacrifice piece with interest after knight takes d7. Grandmaster Shankland did not give up and tried to create complications with queen c4. Grandmaster Komsky continued his attack with knight g5, threatening checkmate on h7. Notice that queen d3, trying to protect the h7 square, is refuted by e4, blocking the queen's protection and renewing the threat of checkmate. So in the game, black played rook f to d8, providing an escape square for the king, but Grandmaster Komsky played queen takes f7 check. White's attack against the exposed king intensifies, and Grandmaster Komsky won a beautiful game thanks to this London system trap. Instead of playing queen e7, which is certainly a reasonable move with careful play, black can also play the tricky b6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop with bishop b7, supporting the center. One temporary drawback to b6 is it weakens the long light square diagonal from h1 to a8. One option for white is to build the tension with queen e2, supporting an eventual e4 pawn break, when black can reply with the solid bishop b7, supporting the center and leading to interesting play. Knight e5 is also an option, and in another Gadakomsky game, he decided to strike in the center immediately with e4. This is a dangerous idea in the London system, adding pressure against black's center and threatening a fork with e5. If black relieves the tension with d takes e4, white can play knight takes e4, adding pressure against black's dark-squared bishop and knight on f6. After the exchanges knight takes e4 and bishop takes e4, as the position opens up, white's light-squared bishop adds pressure on both sides of the board when black's position doesn't feel very comfortable. Instead of relieving the tension, his opponent, Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, played the resourceful bishop e7. Although this retreat may look strange, it avoids the fork on e5 and refuses to open up the center for white's benefit. Komsky continued with e5, taking space, gaining a tempo against the knight, and also opening up the b1 to h7 diagonal for white's bishop, pointing directly at black's castled king. Nakamura calmly responded with knight h5. Black adds pressure against white's dark-squared bishop, when black will often capture it if white castles kingside. The bishop on e7 shows its value, prepared to capture a knight on g5 if white tries to invade black's kingside. In the game, white decided to castle, and after some adventures, the game resulted in a draw. Grandmaster Nakamura, when playing this position as white, has tried the interesting move knight f1, preparing to centralize the knight with knight e3. Although black has to remain careful on the king side, the black position has proven quite solid in practice. Against the London system, black sometimes decides to follow suit and play bishop f5. Just like white, black decides to develop the queenside bishop before playing e6. Both sides can continue their plans with e3 and e6, supporting the center. When playing this position as white, Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen played the straightforward bishop d3, challenging black's active light-squared bishop. His opponent, Grandmaster Anish Giri, traded light-squared bishops with bishop takes d3, queen takes d3. White enjoys a lead in development and is threatening to win a pawn with queen b5 check, so black decided to reinforce the center with c6. In exchange for allowing white a developmental advantage, black is building a solid pawn structure that is not easy to break down. The game continued with the flexible knight d2. This knight can help support two potential pawn breaks, e4 or c4. Grandmaster Giri continued to develop and supported the center with knight f6. White continued with typical London system development with knight g to f3. His opponent responded with the solid bishop e7. When black plays bishop e7, it's worth noting that knight h5 may be a potential resource to keep in mind, trying to remove white's annoying dark-squared bishop. Notice that Grandmaster Carlsen ignores this possibility by simply castling. His point is if black plays knight h5 immediately, he can respond with bishop e5, placing pressure against the g7 pawn and preventing black's misplaced knight on h5 the chance to capture the dark-squared bishop for the time being. Black should consider playing knight d7, although knight takes e5 allows the possibility of d takes e5 when black's knight on h5 doesn't have any safe squares, so it's at risk of being trapped. If black decides to play the impatient f6, black does succeed in eliminating white's dark-squared bishop, but it comes at a terrible price after bishop takes b8. Rook takes b8. By playing the weakening f6, this deprives the wayward knight on h5 a vital escape square, so white can trap the knight with g4, winning a piece. Instead of playing knight h5, black wisely decided to castle the king. Although allowing knight h5 isn't the end of the world for white, especially as it can lead to trouble if black isn't careful, as we approach the middle game, London system players will often insert the move Magnus played, h3, extending the diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, so if black plays knight h5, white has the option to play bishop h2. The move h3 can also support a future kingside initiative with g4, although white should be careful not to play such an idea without carefully considering how it affects white's castled king. Carlsen's plan in the game was to grab space on the queen side with a4 and a5, as well as playing the typical London idea knight e5. Black, on the other hand, remains solid, and one idea is to play knight b to d7, supporting the center, as well as preparing play on the queen side with the pawn break c5, creating reasonable counterplay. In the game, Grandmaster Carlsen was able to positionally outplay his opponent and ended up winning a fine game. Instead of playing bishop f4 immediately, sometimes white decides to play knight f3. Playing bishop f4 on the second or third move in the London system can often transpose into one another, but one important difference to note is that after knight f6, bishop f4, instead of playing the solid e6, if black wants to challenge the London system directly, then an important resource is the ambitious c5. Striking in the center immediately, d takes c5 leads to different play than the typical London system ideas we have seen, and black has been able to demonstrate comfortable play after e6, supporting the center and preparing to regain the pawn with bishop takes c5. Instead, white can support the center with c3, or play the most popular choice e3. Black can decide to play queen b6 immediately, attacking the b2 pawn, trying to highlight the drawback of developing the dark-squared bishop so quickly. In response, white can offer the b2 pawn with the active knight c3, and if black decides to capture the b2 pawn, this will be met by knight b5, adding serious pressure against black's queen side when black's queen may prove quite misplaced on b2. Instead of playing queen b6 immediately, if black intends on following the plan we're about to see, it's important to develop the queenside knight, so a popular choice is knight c6. Removing the knight from the back rank and adding pressure against the center, white understandably supports the center with c3. When black is ready to add serious pressure against white's queenside with queen b6, once again attacking the b2 pawn. If white defends the pawn with queen c2, then black can play g6, followed by bishop f5, creating a comfortable position for black. If white challenges black's queen with queen b3, then black can reply with c4, clamping down on the light squares and attacking white's queen. If white plays queen takes b6, then black can play a takes b6, activating the rook on the a file, when black may prepare future queenside expansion by advancing the b6 pawn with a promising position. Instead of trading queens, if white plays queen c2, then black has the powerful resource bishop f5, actively developing the light-squared bishop and gaining another tempo against the queen. If white accepts the bishop with queen takes f5, this turns out to be a terrible mistake, as black can play queen takes b2, preparing to capture the trapped rook on a1. Notice that developing the knight on c6 is very important for this idea to work, because if the knight were on its original square, this would allow queen c8, checkmate. Instead of capturing the bishop, white can play queen c1. White's position remains relatively solid, although quite passive. Allowing black a comfortable position with active piece play is typically not a position white wants to encourage, so this highlights a potential downside to developing the knight on f3, while black's light-squared bishop can actively use the f5 square. Instead of playing knight f3 after bishop f4, let's take a look at the same idea for black, but this time white will decide to delay developing the knight on g1. After the moves knight f6, e3, c5, c3, and knight c6. We've reached the same sort of position we just examined, but white's knight on g1 is not developed. This allows white to play knight d2. One good rule of thumb to keep in mind is that if black hasn't played e6, blocking the light-squared bishop, then white can delay developing the knight on g1. We can see the difference after queen b6, queen b3. If black tries the same plan with c4, queen c2, bishop f5 is no longer an option, as the rook on a1 is no longer trapped. c4 is a very committal decision by black, especially when white is able to strike in the center with e4, attacking d5, which may prove that the pawn on c4 is overextended. As we can see, there is more to the London system than meets the eye, and there are many subtle move orders leading to interesting play for both sides. By now, this typical London system formation should be quite familiar to us. We are now going to look at a related opening known as the Colle system, in which white is aiming to build this basic formation. In this Colle system formation, white decides to play e3 without developing the dark-squared bishop first. This may seem like a passive decision, but there are some important points to keep in mind. In order to better understand the ideas behind the Colle, we need to take a look at another position for a moment. As we begin our exploration of the Colle system, there's no need to adjust your screen settings. We are looking at the black side of a semi-Slav defense in the Queen's Gambit for a reason. In the Colle system, white will have this exact position, with colors reversed. And since white is up a tempo, we will already see the king's bishop develop to an active square. With black to move, a common idea is to turn the game into the Moran variation with d takes c4, forcing white to lose a tempo with bishop takes c4, which allows black to expand on the queen side and gain another tempo with b5. After the light-squared bishop moves, black will complete development and prepare pawn breaks such as e5, or else reinforce the b5 pawn with a6, followed by striking in the center with c5. This is considered one of black's most active and reliable ways to respond to the Queen's Gambit, and playing this strategy up a tempo will be one of the core ideas behind playing the Colle system as white. We reach the Colle system with e3. Black can respond with the solid e6, supporting the center and preparing kingside development. White activates the light-squared bishop with bishop d3. When after black strikes in the center with c5, white does not want to allow black to play c4, forcing white's bishop to retreat from its excellent diagonal. So there are two typical ways to deal with this threat, c3 or b3. Let's first take a look at white's most classical response, c3. This is known as the Koltanowski variation of the Colle. White builds the same solid pawn structure as in the London system, supporting d4, while also allowing white to respond to c4 with bishop c2. allowing white's bishop to enjoy this active diagonal and preparing to strike in the center with knight b to d2, followed by e4. Instead of playing c4, black usually continues to develop actively with knight c6. Adding more pressure against the center, white continues in typical Colle system fashion with knight b to d2, centralizing the knight and supporting the center. Black sometimes plays the safe and solid bishop e7, but a more ambitious approach is bishop d6, developing the bishop to a more active diagonal. After both sides castle, white has created a position that is commonly played by black in the semi-Slav defense against the queen's gambit. White can decide to immediately play d takes c5. White does give up some control over the center by exchanging a center pawn for the flank pawn on c5, but this forces black to spend another tempo on the dark-squared bishop with bishop takes c5. Now that there isn't a d4 pawn to support, white can play the pawn break e4, or else white can grab space on the queen's side and gain another tempo against the dark-squared bishop with b4, when black can decide to return the bishop to the active d6 square. Instead of playing e4, preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop on the c1 to h6 diagonal once the knight on d2 moves out of the way. Another option to bring the bishop into the game is with bishop b2. If black does not act quickly, white may consider playing a3, reinforcing the b4 pawn, and then striking in the center with c4, opening up the long dark-squared diagonal for the bishop. This means that black can decide to play actively with e5, taking space in the center, threatening a fork with e4. This is a good opportunity for white to counter-strike in the center with e4. White solidifies the center for the time being, when black can continue to play actively with bishop g4, pinning the f3 knight to the queen. White can open up the center with e takes d5, revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure against black's kingside, or first decide to support the center with rook e1. In either case, white isn't necessarily trying to prove an objective advantage, but just like in so many d4 system positions, white is content in achieving a familiar pawn structure, following a consistent plan of development when both sides have reasonable chances, hoping to know the positions better than their opponent. After black plays c5, instead of playing c3, another interesting option is to play b3. Turning the game into the Zukertort variation, white is now prepared to play bishop b2, activating the bishop on the long diagonal, and in some cases, the move b3 helps prepare a future c4, adding pressure against black's center. Once again, black can decide to play the solid, but somewhat less active bishop e7, or prefer to activate the dark-squared bishop with bishop d6. When both sides typically castle, and white activates the dark-squared bishop with bishop b2, supporting the center from the long diagonal, which may also encourage a future knight e5. After black continues with knight c6, activating the knight and supporting the center, white is able to continue development with knight b to d2. Notice that white isn't too worried about the disruptive knight b4, at least for the time being, as white can play bishop e2. Although the e2 square isn't where white prefers to place the light-squared bishop, this is only temporary as white can then regain time by kicking the knight with a3, followed by returning to the more active diagonal with bishop d3 at a later point. In one Grandmaster encounter, former world champion Vishwanathan Anand played c takes d4, preparing possible counterplay on the c-file in the future, while also fixing a white pawn on d4 after e takes d4. Grandmaster Anand then played the crafty b6, possibly preparing knight b4 when bishop a6, offering an exchange of light-squared bishops, becomes a possibility, trying to neutralize a dangerous attacking piece for white. His opponent, Grandmaster Lazaro Brusone, had no interest in allowing this option, so he played the prophylactic a3, preventing knight b4. Anand developed the light-squared bishop with bishop b7. Although black's position is quite solid, the Zukertort variation is not without bite, as white can play the active knight e5, taking space and opening up the possibility of a future f4, reinforcing the centralized knight and preparing a potential kingside pawn storm. Black responded with the sensible queen c7, developing the queen and adding more pressure against the knight on e5. A popular response is f4, reinforcing the centralized knight, but Grandmaster Brusone decided to first play queen e2, protecting the knight and centralizing the queen. His opponent responded with knight e7. The knight prepares to support the king side as it opens up the queen on the c-file, as well as revealing the scope of the light-squared bishop, protecting the d5 pawn, which will help support a future knight e4. White made his attacking intentions known with f4. When after b5, grabbing space and preparing to soften white's queenside dark squares with b4, as a consequence of playing f4, Grandmaster Broussone played the thematic rook lift, rook f3. White is preparing to play rook h3, joining the light-squared bishop and adding pressure against the h7 pawn. It's not out of the question for white to then prepare g4 and g5, adding pressure against the f6 knight, the key defender of the h7 pawn. White was able to create a devastating attack against black's kingside, and even a great player such as Grandmaster Anand was unable to solve his problems, so this is definitely not an opening to underestimate. Although Grandmaster Anand's decision to play c takes d4 was by no means a bad move, a more flexible approach is b6, maintaining the central tension and preparing to develop the light-squared bishop. Once again, Grandmaster Broussone decided to discourage knight b4 by playing a3. When his opponent, legendary Dutch Grandmaster Jan Timman, played bishop b7, continuing to develop and preparing to use this piece to help support the center. White continued with the same attacking plan as in the Anand game with the thematic knight e5. Just like in the Anand game, black played knight e7, revealing the light-squared bishop's support of the d5 pawn, adding an additional protector to the e4 square. By moving the knight to e7, this prevents white from trading knights with knight takes c6 once black plays f6. Broussone continued with the typical f4. Unlike the Anand game, black is able to play a quick knight e4, grabbing space, blocking white's active bishop on d3, and also adding pressure against the knight on d2. After queen e2, Grandmaster Timman evicted the knight from its active post with f6. When after the knight retreated to safety with knight e to f3, black developed a rook and increased pressure down the c-file with rook c8. White decided to shift gears from a kingside attack and added pressure against black's center with c4. In this tension-filled position, black has achieved a solid position against white's Zukertort setup. From a roughly balanced position, black was able to outplay his opponent and went on to win the game. Delaying the development of the light-squared bishop and playing e6 is a solid and reliable choice for black, but it's also possible to develop the light-squared bishop first with bishop f5. White needs to be ready to challenge black's center with c4. This is also white's most active response if black decided to play bishop g4 instead of bishop f5. If black defends the pawn with e6, this encourages white to play a quick queen b3, adding more pressure against the d5 pawn, as well as highlighting the weakness on b7. Black's most solid option is to support the center with c6, turning the game into a popular line of the Slav Defense, since queen b3 can now be met with queen b6, reaching a solid position for black. And although white can still play in Colle system style with knight b to d2, a more active post can be found with knight c3. In order to challenge black, the Colle system player must be ready to occasionally change plans and enter the queen's gambit with an early c4. If you prefer to avoid studying massive amounts of opening theory, and you don't worry about trying to prove an objective advantage as white, then d4 systems such as the London or Colle may be the choice for you. These systems typically create familiar pawn structures and a general idea where to develop your pieces, so you shouldn't suffer a catastrophe out of the opening and can just focus on playing chess. When you face these systems as black, it's worth keeping in mind that with sensible play you shouldn't face any serious problems out of the opening, but do not underestimate these systems. There's plenty of play and possibilities to explore for both sides. Thanks for exploring two of the most popular d4 systems, and best of luck when you find yourself playing with or against these systems.